In this week's main episode of Mythologizing the Bible, we talked about the image of the yoke in Matthew 11. The invitation wasn't to abandon responsibility. The invitation was to choose a burden that fits your deepest values instead of one that's imposed by someone else. That idea raises a bit of an uncomfortable question. What happens when someone convinces us to voluntarily pick up a yoke that slowly steals our freedom? Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. So here's the thing about modern authoritarian movements. They rarely begin with chains. They begin with belonging. They offer certainty in an uncertain world. They offer identity in a confusing world. They offer purpose in a fragmented world. They don't usually conquer everybody by force. They persuade enough people to surrender their autonomy willingly, because doing so feels safe, it feels meaningful, and it often feels empowering. This is where I think it's helpful to stop talking about politics for a moment and start talking about psychology. So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. All right, when people hear the word cult, they often picture this secluded compound, a charismatic guru in flowing robes and long hair. But researchers who study destructive cults generally describe them as one form of what are called high control groups, right? Organizations or movements that systematically shape how their members behave, what information they trust, how they think, and even what emotions they're encouraged to feel. Now, one of the best known frameworks is Stephen Hassan's BITE model: behavior, information, thought, and emotion. The BITE model is about what these cults try to control. They try to control their members' behavior, the information they receive, the thoughts that they think, and even their emotions. Now, ask yourself an honest question. Does any modern political movement exhibit those characteristics? Behavior control? Loyalty is measured not by commitment to constitutional principles or even conservative philosophy. Loyalty is measured by unwavering loyalty to one individual. Public disagreement is treated as betrayal. Or what about information control? Journalists, scientists, judges, election officials, even lifelong conservatives become enemies the moment they contradict the approved narrative. Fake news becomes a convenient label for any information that threatens the movement. Or what about thought control? The world is reduced to these simple binaries: patriots versus traitors, real Americans versus enemies, us versus them, right? Complexity just disappears because independent thinking is dangerous to a movement that's built on certainty. And then there's emotional control. Fear becomes the fuel. Fear of immigrants, fear of crime, fear of demographic change, fear that the nation can only be saved by one uniquely gifted leader who alone can restore greatness. And grievance becomes an identity. And the leader becomes not just a politician, but a kind of indispensable savior. Now that combination should sound pretty doggone familiar. Not because it belongs to one political party, though, but because it appears again and again and again in the study of high control groups. And the most tragic part is that many people inside these movements, they sincerely believe they are the freest people in the country. They see themselves as rebels resisting the establishment. They see themselves as independent thinkers refusing to be manipulated by the press. I don't doubt the sincerity of that feeling. I really don't. But autonomy isn't measured by how loudly we reject one authority. It's measured by whether we reserve the right to question our own. Do we reserve the right to question the people that we're following or the group that we feel like we belong to? The moment you can no longer criticize your leader without risking your place in the community, that's the moment you stop asking hard questions, because the group already has all of the answers. The moment your identity depends on staying in ideological lockstep, you've traded something very precious away. You've traded your capacity for self-authorship. You've traded it for the comfort of someone else's claimed certainty. And that's the most dangerous yoke of all, because the person wearing it often believes they've never been more free. If what we just talked about is true, then we have to be willing to turn the mirror around. We have to be able to look into the mirror ourselves. I identify as politically progressive. Most of the people listening to this podcast probably lean that way too. That makes this next part probably a bit uncomfortable, but it also makes it necessary. If we believe the danger lies only on the other side of the political aisle, we've already stopped thinking critically. Now, let me be clear. There are important differences between today's progressive movement and the MAGA movement. It would be incredibly inaccurate to pretend they are simply mirror images of one another. But that's not my concern. My concern is that the same psychological habits that make high control groups possible can begin to appear anywhere that people become more committed to belonging than they are committed to the truth. And you can already see hints of this. Sometimes nuance is treated as weakness. Asking a clarifying question is interpreted as disloyalty. And people become afraid to say, well, I agree with 90% of this, but I'm not convinced about the other 10. The pressure isn't always explicit either. A lot of times the pressure is social. The algorithm rewards outrage. The loudest voices receive the most attention. And before long, people begin sort of editing their own thoughts because disagreement feels too costly. And that's not healthy. Now, I've also become concerned by the rise of all these ideological purity tests. Look, we all have values that should be non-negotiable. But there are things like human dignity, equal justice under the law, democracy, basic civil rights. Those aren't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the expectation that every good person has to hold exactly the same opinion on every issue. They have to use precisely just the right vocabulary. They have to share every viral post. They have to applaud every activist strategy and just instantly adopt the newest consensus before there's even time to think about it. That isn't curiosity. That's just another form of compliance. And compliance has this nasty habit of somehow masquerading as a virtue. The irony is that progressives often criticize conservatives for demanding ideological conformity while we're quietly building smaller versions of the same social pressure within our own communities. We risk replacing one orthodoxy with another. One set of slogans with a different set of slogans. We're just replacing one approved vocabulary with another approved vocabulary. And friends, that's not progress. Humanism asks more of us than that. It asks us to think, to question, to revise our opinions when better evidence appears, and to treat people as individuals instead of as some sort of ideological avatars. Humanism asks us to remain intellectually humble enough to admit that our own side can be wrong. And not just tactically wrong, sometimes we can be morally wrong. History is full of movements that began with these noble intentions and then just slowly drifted toward dogmatism, because questioning the movement became more dangerous than questioning reality. That's why I don't want a blue version of MAGA. I don't want a movement built around unquestioning loyalty to charismatic personalities. I don't want a movement where social acceptance depends on ideological perfection. I don't want a movement where algorithms determine our emotional lives or where outrage becomes our primary political strategy. Because if we become that, I think we've already lost. Maybe not the election, but definitely something more important. We've lost the very values that made the movement worth defending in the first place. The goal isn't to replace one high control group with another. The goal is to build a society where no political movement, no religious institution, no media ecosystem, no charismatic leader ever becomes more important than our own capacity to ask difficult questions. To me, that's what autonomy looks like. And without it, every movement, no matter how noble its stated goals are, every movement contains the seeds of its own corruption. So where does this leave us? If we've learned anything from this conversation, it should be that autonomy is a hell of a lot harder than either side of our political culture wants us to believe. It isn't simply voting a certain way. Autonomy isn't rejecting authority just because it's authority. And it's certainly not doing whatever we want while we're pretending nobody else matters. Real autonomy begins with integrity. Integrity means having the courage to think for yourself, even when your own tribe would rather that you didn't. Integrity means being willing to say, I agree with most of this, but I think we're wrong about that thing over there. Integrity means refusing to outsource our conscience to a politician or a pastor or a YouTube personality or influencer or even your favorite live streamer or podcaster. And yes, that includes me. If I ever become someone you feel that you just cannot question, well, I've become part of the problem. Autonomy also requires curiosity. It requires integrity, but it requires curiosity. The curiosity isn't collecting facts that support what you already believe. Curiosity is the willingness to ask, what if I'm wrong? Curiosity is reading sources you disagree with. It's listening long enough to understand before deciding whether you agree or not. Curiosity is one of the few habits that can break the spell of a high control group, because curiosity makes absolute certainty impossible. But here's the part we often miss. Autonomy isn't just an individual achievement. Autonomy is a collective responsibility. My freedom depends in part on yours. If my neighbor is bullied into silence or pressured into conformity or manipulated by propaganda, my community becomes less capable of solving problems honestly. A healthy democracy doesn't need millions of identical people marching in perfect ideological formation. A healthy democracy needs millions of thoughtful people who freely choose to cooperate because they share a commitment to one another's dignity. That's a very different vision of freedom than the one we usually hear. So instead of asking, how do I win? We should begin asking, how do we create the conditions where everyone has the opportunity to think independently? That means investing in quality education. It means protecting a free press, supporting scientific literacy, encouraging civil disagreement. And it means building an economy where people have enough stability to think about tomorrow's bills, not just the ones that are sitting in front of them today. People living in constant fear, well, they're a lot easier to manipulate than people who have the time, the security, and the confidence to ask difficult questions. So we need to figure out how to give people time, security, and confidence. In other words, the strongest defense against high control groups and cults isn't to create a better cult. The strongest defense is to create a healthier society, a society where children are taught how to think instead of just being taught what to think. A society where disagreement isn't treated as some sort of betrayal. A society where changing your mind is seen as evidence of learning rather than as some sort of flip-floppy weakness. A society where belonging isn't conditional on blind obedience. That kind of community, though, it doesn't happen by accident. It's built person by person, conversation by conversation, one decision at a time. Every time you question a slogan instead of repeating it. Every time you choose evidence over instant outrage. Every time you treat someone with dignity, even while disagreeing with them, you're strengthening the habits that make a free society possible. Autonomy isn't the freedom to stand alone. Autonomy is the freedom to stand together without surrendering your mind or your core values. As we celebrate the 4th of July in the United States, we spend a lot of time talking about political freedom. But political freedom is only half the story. A nation can declare its independence, but its citizens can still surrender their minds to fear, propaganda, tribal loyalty, or even charismatic leaders. Our greatest freedom is the one that no government can give us and no political movement has the right to take away. And that's the freedom to think for ourselves. So here's my challenge for you this week. Put down any political yoke that demands that you stop asking questions. Put down any movement that tells you empathy is weakness, or curiosity is betrayal, or independent thinking is dangerous. Whether that pressure comes from the right, the left, a church, a media outlet, or just even your own social circle. Recognize it for what it is. It's a threat to your autonomy. A healthy democracy isn't built by people who all think alike. It's built by citizens who are thoughtful enough to question their own assumptions. They're courageous enough to change their minds when the evidence changes. And they're compassionate enough to defend the dignity of people who disagree with them. Your mind belongs to you. Protect it. Challenge it. Keep it open. And never, never hand it over to anyone who promises certainty in exchange for your freedom. Happy Independence Day. I truly hope you realize that your greatest act of independence will always be having the courage to think for yourself. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at The Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for different age groups. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. It provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.